There's a stretch of woods not too far from where I live, where the trees grow so thick you can't see much past 10 feet in any direction. I had hiked the woods before, but never went far. It's all pines, packed together like they're trying to choke out the sky, and the farther you walk into them, the darker it gets. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a way to clear my head. I'd had a shitty week, work was kicking my ass, and my girlfriend had just left me. She said I was distant, disconnected. I couldn't argue with her. I'd felt off for months. It was like everything was just a little out of sync, like I was living a half second behind everyone else. It was barely visible through the pines, just a dark shape nestled between the trunks, like it had been there forever, forgotten by the world. I walked past the trees to the clearing where the cabin was. The wood was gray with age, the roof was sagging, and one of the windows was shattered. It didn't look welcoming, but something about it drew me in. So I drove out of the woods, hoping the quiet might help. It was late afternoon when I started walking. The sun was still up, but the time I hit the tree line, the pines swallowed it. The air got cooler, the shadows longer, and every step felt like it took me farther away from the world I knew. But that's what I wanted, a little space, a little distance. I walked for what felt like hours, deeper and deeper, until I started to wonder whether I could find my way back. That's when I saw it, the cabin. I stepped through the trees and onto the overgrown path leading to the cabin's front door. I should have turned around. I don't know why I didn't. I just wanted to look inside. The door cracked when I pushed it open. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust. There was hardly any light except for the dim glow filtering through the trees outside. The floor was covered in dirt and debris, broken glass, leaves, something that might have been bones, though I didn't look too closely. I wasn't alone. At first, I thought it was just the sound of my own footsteps echoing in the small space, but then I heard it again. First a shuffle, then a breath, and then a voice. Welcome, stranger. I froze. The voice was low, almost a whisper, but it came from deeper inside the cabin, from the shadows. My heart hammered in my chest. Oh, I'm sorry, I stammered, and I turned to leave, but the door had swung shut behind me, trapping me in the dark. The voice came again, clearer this time. You've come far, but this is where you stay. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt something, a presence. It wasn't friendly. My legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor, and the air around me seemed to thicken. My head swam, and suddenly I wasn't sure where I was. The cabin felt wrong, like it wasn't just a building, but something alive, something watching. I took a step back, my foot crunching on the debris beneath me, and that's when I noticed it. The cabin was changing. The walls began to shift, move, and change direction. The room almost felt like it was breathing, expanding and contracting in slow, shallow breaths. The windows, where there should have been fading light from outside, were now pitch black, as if the cabin had disappeared entirely into a void. And the floor beneath my feet, it wasn't dirt and debris anymore. It was stone, cold, damp stone. I don't know how long I stood there watching the impossible changes, but when I turned around, the front door was gone. In its place was a hallway, long, narrow corridor stretching out into the dark. The voice came again, closer now. Keep going. I didn't want to, but I didn't have a choice. My feet moved on their own, carrying me through the hall, the walls pressing in on me as I went. The deeper I went, the more everything around me twisted. The floor sloped at impossible angles. The walls pulsed like they were alive, and the air grew thicker, harder to breathe. And the voice, God, the voice, it followed me, whispering things I couldn't understand, words that didn't make sense but filled me with dread. By the time I reached the end of the hall, I wasn't even sure if I was still in the cabin. The space around me was so wrong, like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. The walls were lined with symbols, crudge, jagged things carved into the wood and the stone. Symbols that seemed to shift when I looked away. My head ached, and time wasn't right anymore. I checked my phone, but the screen was blank. No signal, no time, no nothing. My watch had stopped, its hands frozen in place. I couldn't tell how long I'd been there, minutes, hours, days. It didn't matter. There was no escape. At the end of the hallway there was a door, old, rotten, hanging on rusty hinges. I didn't want to open it, but the voice, now right beside me, breathing in my ear, left me no choice. Open it. I reached for the handle, my hand trembling. The door swung open on its own, revealing a room. The room was white, bright white. White walls, white floor, and a bright white light, and a single metal chair. And sitting in a chair was me. Now, I don't know how to explain it. It was me, but old, gaunt, pale, like I hadn't seen sunlight in years. My eyes were sunken, my skin scratched tight over my bones. The other me looked up, meeting my gaze, and smiled. Finally, he, I said, it was the most horrifying thing I've ever seen. Sit, the voice said. It wasn't just in my head anymore, it was coming from the other me. I backed away, but the door slammed shut behind me. There was nowhere to go. The other me stood moving with slow, deliberate grace and stepped toward me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The other me reached out, his hand cold and clammy. and touched my shoulder. At that moment, he did. Everything changed. I was the one in the chair now, looking at the door, the same door I had just come through. I could feel the presence all around me, the same cold, malevolent force that had followed me from the moment I entered the cabin. I waited for what felt like eternity, stuck in the chair. It felt like as if decades had passed. I watched my body grow old, gaunt, and pale, and then the door opened and someone stepped in. It was me again. This cabin, this place, it traps you, it twists you, breaks you, and then it makes you a part of it. A loop, an endless cycle of fear and confusion, of watching yourself walk through the door over and over again, knowing what was coming but powerless to stop it. The voice spoke one last time as I watched myself approach the chair. Welcome home. I feel like I was in the loop for centuries. Time doesn't work the same way in the cabin. It's endless. Every moment stretches out like eternity, and yet it all blurs together. I've lost track of how many times I've watched myself walk through that door and sit in this chair, growing old until I walk through the door again. Every time myself approaches the chair, I'm then in the chair again, but younger again. But I began to feel a change. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the air. The presence, through it never spoke to me again, didn't feel like it was watching me anymore. Almost as if I was distracted, I could feel it shifting its focus elsewhere. I don't understand why until the door cracked open. It wasn't me this time. It was someone else. Someone new. Someone fresh. He was younger than me, maybe in his early 20s, with shaggy hair and confused expression on his face. He looked around the room like I had when I first came here, his eyes wide with fear and disbelief. And then he saw me, sitting in the chair. I wanted to warn him. I wanted to tell him to turn back, to run, but the words wouldn't come. I could only watch as he moved closer. Then, for the first time, I felt like I had control over my body again. I stood up, facing the man. I knew what I was supposed to do. I placed my hand on his shoulder, like the older me had done the first time I entered. Although, was it the first time? Through tired breaths, I forced the words, "It's your turn." The man was then in the chair, and for the first time in what felt like centuries, I crossed the threshold back out into the hallway to leave the cabin. I turned one last time to the room, to the man, a look of terror in his eyes, his body now paralyzed in the chair. "I'm sorry," I said to him before turning. Leaving the cabin, I no longer felt as if the presence was watching me. I knew it was done with me, and its focus now it's on the new prize. The moment I stepped out of the cabin, the air changed. The oppressive weight lifted completely, and the suffocating darkness that had surrounded me for so long was gone. I was back in the woods, standing under a sky that was now brilliant, blinding blue. I fell to my knees, gasping for air. The pines swayed gently in the breeze. Birds chirped overhead, and the world felt real again. But it should have been different after everything I'd endured. Surely the world outside had changed. Surely centuries had passed. With shaky legs, I made my way out of the pines. My car was still parked at the edge of the woods, right where I'd left it. The trees looked the same, the path untouched, even the air smelled the same, crisp and cool, like it had the first time afternoon when I walked into the forest. I pulled out my phone. The screen flickered to life, displaying the date and the time. It had only been a few hours. I looked at myself in the camera and I looked fine. My breath hitched and I stumbled back, staring at the device in disbelief. Somehow, despite everything I'd been through, despite the endless time I'd felt trapped in that hellish loop, almost no time had passed at all. The world hadn't changed, but I had. I drove home in a daze, the events of the cabin swirling in my mind. When I pulled into my driveway, everything was the same. The neighbors' cars were parked where they always are. The street was quiet, familiar. But I know what happened. I know the place, whatever it is, exists. And somehow, impossibly, I've been given another chance. But I know one thing, I will never step foot back in those woods. I know if I do, I might not be lucky enough to get out a second time. And if you ever find yourself walking through the pines and you see a cabin, run.